The sun dipped low over the endless Kansas plains, painting the wheat fields in streaks of gold and fire. The rhythmic hum of cicadas was broken by the distant rumble of engines, an approaching convoy of black SUVs slicing through the quiet town road. Folks gathered outside an old red barn that had seen a century of harvests and heartbreak. Some came out of curiosity, others out of loyalty, and a few with arms crossed, ready to challenge every word to come. When the first car door opened, Donald Trump stepped out, flanked by aides and a few local officials. Cameras flashed, capturing his familiar confident stride. But beneath the applause was an undertone of caution. These people didn't need promises, they needed proof. Trump smiled, waved, and headed inside where rows of metal folding chairs and the smell of dust and hay filled the air. Among the townspeople stood Earl Jenkins, a farmer whose weathered face told the story of hard seasons and harder debts. His calloused hands were stained by soil, his back bowed from years behind a plow. His family had worked that land for 4 generations, and lately, it felt like the world had forgotten them. Trump began to speak, his voice commanding the room. No one understands the heart of this country better than our farmers. You are the backbone of America. Applause followed, but not from everyone. Earl stayed still, eyes fixed on the man at the front, his jaw tightening. Words came easy for politicians, but words didn't stop crops from failing. The air thickened, anticipation blending with skepticism. Conversations hushed. Even the cicadas seemed to pause outside. Earl shifted his boots, feeling the eyes of his neighbors on him. Trump's speech carried on with vigor, but a silent challenge had already been issued across that small-town barn. 2 worlds, one built on talk, the other on toil, had just come face to face. And before the night was over, they would collide. The barn had grown hot under the weight of words. Trump's speech had ended, but the air still buzzed with polite applause and quiet doubt. When he finally opened the floor for questions, hands hesitated, no one wanted to go first. Then, from the back, Earl Jenkins stood up. The wooden chair creaked as he pushed it aside. His weathered hat hung in his hand, and the veins in his forearms stood out like rope. "Mr. President," Earl said, his tone respectful but edged with steel. "You say you stand for folks like me, but my fields are drying up. My costs keep rising, and half the policies you talk about were written by men who've never had dirt under their nails." A low murmur rippled through the room. Trump's head lifted. He straightened his jacket and replied evenly, "We've cut taxes, increased trade deals, and brought jobs back. You're better off than before." Earl shook his head slowly. "Maybe on paper, but papers don't feed my cattle. My boy had to sell his tractor to keep the lights on." His voice rose, raw, unpolished, aching with years of effort no one had seen. "You say America's strong, but what about the towns that are dying quietly while the headlines brag about stock markets?" Trump's tone sharpened. "We've done more for rural America than anyone before me. Believe me, some people just don't want to see progress." That struck a nerve. Earl stepped forward, pointing slightly toward the podium. Not with aggression, but with hurt. "Progress? When your neighbor's land sells for scrap. When the bank calls every other week. You call that progress?" Silence swallowed the barn. Reporters leaned in. The 2 men locked eyes, one powerful, one proud, but neither looked away. The tension wasn't about policy anymore. It was about dignity, about being seen. Then something subtle shifted. Trump didn't interrupt. He just listened. Earl noticed. The crowd, too. For the first time that evening, politics gave way to something rare. An unspoken, grudging respect between 2 men who refused to back down. The last of the applause faded into the echo of shuffling boots and murmured goodbyes. Folding chairs scraped against the old wooden floor as townsfolk trickled out into the cooling Kansas night. Earl Jenkins was among the first to leave. His shoulders were tense, his steps heavy. As he passed the doorway, he muttered under his breath, "Talk never fixed a broken fence." Outside, the sun had disappeared, leaving streaks of purple and gray across the horizon. Inside the barn, Trump stood still. The energy that had filled the room minutes ago was gone, replaced by a heavy silence. His aides whispered in low tones, talking about schedules, routes, and tomorrow's media briefing. He didn't respond. His gaze drifted toward the dusty window. Through it, he saw Earl leaning against his old pickup, hat in hand, staring at the empty road. The farmer looked smaller now, not weak, but worn, like a man carrying the weight of too many seasons. For the first time that day, Trump's usual expression softened. "Sir, we should be leaving," one aide reminded him. Trump didn't answer right away. He kept watching the man by the truck, the one who'd stood up to him without fear, who'd spoken with honesty rather than applause in mind. Something about that stayed with him. Finally, he said quietly, "Let's stay a while." The aide blinked. "Sir." Trump turned from the window, his tone even. "He's got more to say, and maybe I should listen." Outside, the night deepened. Crickets sang, and a distant wind stirred the wheat. The crowd was gone, but something important, something human, was just beginning. The world was still dark when the first scream split the silence. A neighbor's pickup tore down the dirt road, headlights slicing through the fog. Smoke clawed at the sky behind it. Earl Jenkins bolted upright in bed, heart hammering. He threw on his boots before he was even fully awake. When he stepped outside, his worst fear came alive. His north barn was on fire. Flames roared through the roof, sparks jumping into the dry grass around it. He grabbed a hose, but the water pressure was weak. His wife called the fire department, voice shaking. Within minutes, trucks from nearby towns were on their way, but the wind was strong, and the fire was spreading. Earl's livelihood, his tractors, feed, half his stored harvest, was going up in smoke. Headlights began to appear along the road. Neighbors, reporters who'd stayed overnight, curious locals. Then one vehicle stood out, a black SUV pulling up beside the fence. Donald Trump stepped out. No cameras followed, no press release trailed him. Just the man himself, sleeves rolled up, eyes locked on the burning barn. Without hesitation, he strode toward the blaze, shouting to the volunteers. "Form a line. Buckets here. Keep that side wet." His voice carried the same command it did on stage, but this time it wasn't for applause. Earl turned, disbelief painted across his soot-streaked face. "What in the world are you doing here?" he shouted over the roar. Trump didn't answer. He just grabbed a hose from a stunned firefighter and started spraying the flames. The two men worked side by side, coughing, soaked, faces smeared with ash. Time disappeared into the chaos. Every so often, their eyes met, briefly, wordlessly, as if both understood that this moment meant more than any debate ever could. When the last ember hissed into silence, the barn stood half-charred but still upright. The crowd stayed quiet, watching the two men stand shoulder to shoulder, chests heaving, covered in smoke and sweat. Earl finally broke the silence, voice low. "Didn't think I'd see you here, sir." Trump gave a faint, tired smile. "Didn't think I'd be here either." And in that smoky dawn light, they weren't president and farmer anymore. Just two men who refused to let something good burn to the ground. Dawn broke slow and soft over the Kansas plains, the smoke from the fire still lingering in thin gray ribbons that drifted toward the horizon. The air smelled of char and coffee. Trucks lined the dirt road leading to Earl Jenkins's farm, their beds piled high with lumber, tools, and tarps. The entire town had shown up. Farmers, mechanics, church volunteers, even high school kids still rubbing sleep from their eyes. Hammers rang like church bells. Women set up long tables filled with food. Laughter rose over the steady thud of work. In the middle of it all stood Earl, his face streaked with soot and exhaustion but alive with gratitude. His barn was wounded but not gone, and neither was his hope. Across the yard, Trump lifted a board with two men, his jacket gone, shirt rolled to the elbows. The cameras that had followed him yesterday were nowhere to be seen. When one reporter tried to approach, Trump raised a hand. "Not today," he said firmly. "This one's not for headlines." Earl walked up, wiping his hands on a rag. For the first time, his tone carried no edge. "Guess you're not all talk after all," he said, a hint of a smile tugging his weathered face. Trump looked at him and chuckled quietly. Neither are you. They stood there a moment. No audience, no stage, just two men surrounded by the sound of rebuilding. The world around them was simple again. Work to be done, neighbors to help, land to protect. As the sun climbed higher, children carried water to the workers, women served breakfast, and the barn slowly began to take shape once more. In that morning light, pride gave way to partnership, and politics melted into something far more lasting, respect. Earl glanced at the rising frame of his barn and whispered, "Looks like we'll make it after all." Trump nodded. "That's America, Earl. Always does." By the time the sun rose over the wheat fields again, the farm was quiet. The barn, though still scarred by smoke, stood firm, its new beams glowing pale in the early light. Earl Jenkins sat on his porch, a mug of coffee cradled in his rough hands. The same porch his father once sat on, watching dawn break over the land they both loved. The night's chaos had passed, leaving behind something wordless but powerful. A sense that things, somehow, had been set right. Down the dirt road, the familiar hum of engines grew louder. The convoy had returned. Trump's aides loaded the last of the equipment into the black SUVs. Before climbing in, Trump turned once more toward the farmhouse. Through the tinted glass, his eyes met Earl's from across the field. He gave a small nod, no speech, no wave, just a simple human gesture that said everything words could not. Earl tipped his hat in return. The vehicles rolled away, kicking up a trail of dust that shimmered in the morning light. The town would soon return to its rhythms. The markets, the schools, the endless cycles of planting and harvest. But something deeper had changed. News of the fire and the president's unexpected hand in fighting it spread quietly at first, then far and wide. But the story that stuck wasn't about politics or power. It was about a man who showed up when it mattered, and a farmer who learned that even giants could kneel beside him in the dirt. Weeks later, during a rally in another state, Trump mentioned it briefly. "There's a farmer in Kansas who reminded me what real America means." The crowd cheered, but for Earl, far from the cameras, the words didn't matter much. He rose from the porch, watching the morning sun climb above his fields. The light hit the rebuilt barn, and he smiled faintly. Some fires destroy, others reveal what's worth saving.